Our next award is the Cornelia B. Rose Jr. Award. It's very fitting that this award tonight, that the family that's being awarded this award is being awarded on the eve of the anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education decision. So how appropriate that is. The Cornelia B. Rose Jr. Award is given annually to the person or group who has made a significant contribution to the advancement and preservation of Arlington history. We are so honored to have the Hamm family with us tonight to receive this award. On February 2nd, 1959, 4 black students walked into Stratford Junior High School, having the historic distinction of being the first to integrate Arlington Public Schools. One of those 4, Michael Jones, is actually with us tonight. Michael, why don't you stand? While that event is well remembered and honored, it is important to note that that event, was just a step in a long journey. It is important to note that in September of 1957, Edward Leslie Hamm Jr., who has joined us tonight, attempted to enter Stratford with 2 other black students and was turned away. He returned home because his parents had refused to turn in the pupil placement form that would send him to a different all-black school, rightly believing the pupil placement forms were obstacles put in place to block desegregation. Mr. and Mrs. Hamm's strong stance for educational equity is what we honor tonight. African American families such as the Hamms put their precious children on the line for the benefit of all, and yes, here in Arlington, had crosses burned on their lawns, hateful phone calls in the middle of the night, and hate mail sent to their homes. The risk of violence against their families was always in their mind, yet they persevered. The Hamm family that sits at the banquet tonight draws their legacy from this strong couple and their children who demonstrated courage and leadership as they stood up to the beliefs of the time to pave a way forward for the future. Thankfully, Mr. and Mrs. Hamm were also insightful enough to save the many documents that now allow us to tell this story. Their legacy is passed to their children and family who have so graciously donated, shared their stories, helped others tell their stories of the era, and loaned their documents to the Arlington Historical Society, the Black Heritage Museum, and the Langston Citizens Association so that we can make sure that their story continues to be told. We are proud to honor the Hamm family with the Cornelia B. Rose Jr. Award. We ask that the children of Mr. and Mrs. Hamm please come to the podium.
Thank you all so very much. My mother would be 100 years old right now, should she still be alive. She passed away, I believe, at 86. Is what
2000.
I'm not talking about the year. I'm talking about the age. I gotta, at the age of 80, 85. Okay. My father lived to be 96?
Yes.
Okay, something right. Those of you who know Carmela know that she's a real trail boss and of the family, and we're very, very proud of what she has come back to the county to do over the last 10 years or so. It's really made all of us in the county, all of you, very, very proud of what this county has accomplished over the years. It has amazed me. I've been gone about 50 years, a little over 50 years from the county. I live in South Florida and with also a home in Virginia Beach. When we attempted to integrate schools starting in 54 or 55, 1954 or 55, say that so my sister won't correct me. My mother and father, but my mother to a major degree, spent a tremendous amount of time with folks in the neighborhood and folks in the county and attorneys who were graduates of Howard University, who were primarily out of Richmond, to help build a case. Those attorneys were involved in the 1954 National Brown decision and started to work on different locations, Farmville and Norfolk and in Arlington back at that time. Those of us who were young didn't quite understand why it was worth the trouble, but my mother and father, despite questions that sometimes I had as the older sibling, at the dinner table insisted that we continue to move forward and insisted that my name be used despite some of my protests and some of the court suits. And with my initial involvement in 1957 at 12 years old at Stratford, I was all of 5'4", with a book bag this big, trying to walk the several blocks to the school through frightening crowds, and then to be turned away by the principal, and then back through those crowds and tremendous amount of press. That was it for me. I said, okay, I did my part. I'm not sure I want to do this, continue to do this, but my mother was always very insistent, and my father didn't have to tell you to do things but once, and you did it. Those of my relatives that are here understand that. And before I go on, let me ask all the Hamm family and relatives that are here to stand. I have two children. I'm going to ask them to stand separately so you know who they are. Nico and Rodney. And I have and I also have one of their grandchildren that are here, Lisi and Gabriella. They're college students, one at Georgia Tech and the other at UNC Wilmington, but going to University of Hawaii next year. She's a surfer with the great whites. That's it. My brother also has his son and daughter here. I'd like for them to stand, Bernard and Donnie. And Carmela has not seen fit to give us nieces and nephews, so we could get even with her, but so she'd know how it feels. I was 13 when she was born. I'd like to say just another word or two about my mother. I'd like for you to know a little bit more about her. She was born on a farm in Caroline County, which the three of us now own, and moved up to Bailey's Crossroads in Fairfax, sometimes now, I guess now Falls Church. Sometimes it was Alexandria. Fairfax has been in 3 different counties and over the years, and grew up there in Bailey's Crossroads as the oldest daughter of a mother who worked as an elevator operator in Washington and farmed on originally 20 acres and then 10-acre farmette. When they first moved there, they lived in a shed, and they eventually built a house around that shed. My mother, as the oldest daughter, for my grandmother, who was a single parent, divorced, my mother raised her brothers and sisters, and she was the surrogate mother for all of them. Her brothers are all gone. Matter of fact, her sister is gone now too. But I'd like for the children of my mother's brothers to stand. I know I have at least 2 of them here. And again, I'm sorry, I don't want to take your time to introduce everyone, and I'm not a big speaker. I'm an engineer, and I always say that I'm not a Republican or a Democrat, I'm an engineer. So you kind of understand, but the family has been very, very proud. My mother, when I was born in 1950, my mother was an administrator on the administrative staff in the Pentagon. And she had to be one of the first African Americans to work in administrative capacity in the Pentagon. She was a clerk, and she retired as the secretary to the Army Surgeon General. So she was someone who was kind of used to working quietly to get things done. She would have never been in the forefront of any recognition like this, much less a school named after her. She would have been obviously very honored and very humbled to do that. And those few of you who are here who have worked with her would know that about her. She not only led the integration efforts, she later worked the polls, was a poll captain for a precinct in Arlington, and worked behind the scenes for the Democratic Party. And in the 60s, I used to question that because of the Southern Democrats and why do you want to do that? And she had a longer view than I could have had in the 60s. But she worked very diligent at those things and was very successful. My father was always very quiet. He always left home every day carrying a paper bag of lunch and newspaper under his arm, and walked about a mile to the bus stop and caught the bus into Washington. He was the first in his family to go to college, and I happened to attend that same college, Hampton Institute, now Hampton University, as did my daughter and my son. As a matter of fact, got a master's degree from there after going to Howard. But my father grew up on a farm in Newport News, Virginia, and worked in shipyard for a year and went to college and came out and taught school in Manassas, in a black school in Manassas. I met my mother there when my mother escorted her younger sister who was then a student. My mother was several years out of school, to a dance, and met my father, and I guess the rest was history. My father was away during World War II, and came back before I was conceived and just after I was born, and worked as a draftsman in Washington because they were not hiring any black engineers. My father was an architectural engineer, and eventually became the lead architect in a small firm, and eventually went to work for the General Services Administration when I was probably at Stratford. By the time, and what else I'm going to tell you about my father, I didn't know until he was probably 70 years old. And he was sharing this with me about 25 years ago. But my father went to work for the General Services Administration, and those of you here in the Washington area know the General Services Administration is responsible for all the public buildings that are owned by the government. My father was, according to him, was the General Services Administration for the design and construction of the Kennedy Center. And following that, he was the federal government's national representative expert for solar energy demonstration projects around the country. And he retired in his 60s, probably 65 or earlier. And we built a house together in Caroline County, and my family then lived there in Caroline County until each of their deaths. And we still own that property as well as his home in Arlington, which Carmela owns, and my brother owns one that belonged to my father originally. That's beside that house here in Arlington. So we're a family of people who worked hard, who did many things. I will, because I think would be of some interest to you, I was judged not qualified to go to white schools through various means, including a psychological test that they did for all of the black students to try to determine who might be acceptable to go. I went to Stratford in 1959 in September because the federal courts awarded those in the second lawsuit, made a decision on that before they made a decision on the first lawsuit, which I was a party of. So even though Mike and 3 others of our friends went in February, I did get to go in the 9th grade in September of 1959. I did graduate, made the honor roll a couple times, which was kind of amazing to both them and me, but I was a B student at the Historical Black Junior High, Senior High School, and I made equal grades at Stratford. And as my mother tells it in her later years, because I graduated from Stratford in 1960, and again, we were all in caps and gowns and walking across the stage, and to me, it was not a big deal, but to my mother, she tells me that I was the first African American to graduate from a previously white-owned school in Virginia. And so I said to my mother, look, it was not just me, it was me and Barbara Harrison. She said, yeah, but Hamm came before Harrison. At the risk of taking another few minutes, can I do that? I want to tell you a little bit about me, since I've said so much to you after graduating from Washington Lee. When I went to Stratford and then to Washington Lee, it was against the law in Virginia for whites and blacks to play sports together, go to clubs together, share anything together. It was just the schools were integrated and we had to go home. And for folks like me and my brother who loved to play sports, that was a real disadvantage. One of my classmates in the 9th grade, Ed Hummer, who's here, who was all Virginia, maybe all Washington, D.C. as a star center at Washington Lee in my class when we were there, is just a great human being. And I wanted to thank him for all he's done with my sister across the county in recent years. I went to college at Hampton University in Hampton. I turned down a scholarship to go to Penn State because I had enough of white people at that time. I wanted to be me. It was nothing against white people. I just, I wanted to go where I could, kind of be myself, and, you had to watch, criticism for who you talk to. You couldn't dance with people at a dance. There's a lot you couldn't do. So I did that, and I graduated with a BS degree. I worked for Westinghouse in their Defense and Space Center in Baltimore. Actually, I was in their graduate student program, at any rate, I had worked for Bell Labs as an intern, as an engineering intern while I was in school, and with Westinghouse as an engineer. I worked as an industrial engineer, a manufacturing engineer, and then a production manager, and then a marketing manager for an electronics assembly plant, all in my early 20s. I then went to work for a large computer company that's back then known as Control Data Corporation, but merged with Hewlett-Packard. And I was the engineering and facilities manager for Washington, D.C. operations for them also in my mid-20s. I went to work for Booz Allen in Hamilton at 27 or 8. I was a senior industrial engineering consultant, then a senior management consultant. I was one of the few African-American, very few, who were management consultants. After 2 years, Booz Allen assigned me to go in and bail out consulting projects that were in trouble. Worked all over the country for a variety of organizations, from Army ammunition plants to newspaper, Philadelphia Inquirer, newspaper printing, many other kinds of companies that made lipstick tubes for Avon or Germaine Montiel Cosmetics, or many post offices. I briefed in Postmaster General when I was in my 20s for Booz Allen, and I ended up being doing executive search for Booz Allen in my late 20s, spent a year and a half doing that. I then took a job as Director of Applied Research in support of the Navy's Fleet Ballistic Missile Submarine Program. And I had a large staff of PhDs and MBAs and statisticians and others that worked for me in doing that. And during that time, I had the honor of briefing for probably 10 minutes the Army Chief of Staff. And I have pictures today that the Army took of that briefing, of the Army Chief of Staff, which most of you know is the most senior military man in the country. Several predecessors to Colin Powell and others that you might recognize. I left there to run a large consulting firm, and then for the last 40 years I've run my own firm. I've worked around the world with up to 40 consultants, and I'm down retired the last few years. So again, the reason that I've taken this time to tell you that is that out of the integration of the schools here in Arlington, many of us have gone on to do great things in sports and in the business world and elsewhere, and we're very proud to have done the things, or had the opportunity to do the things that we've done. So thank you very much.
I just would like to say something. I'll try to be very quick with this. My family, especially my parents, submitted their lives in service. I remember being a very young girl in elementary school, going with my mother to the houses of individuals in our neighborhood who could not read, as my mother assisted in teaching them how to read. My mother was very instrumental in starting the Head Start and the ACAP program in Arlington County. She taught at several schools in that capacity, was the assistant registrar for the Woodlawn precinct for 27 years. She did numerous things, had a Brownie troupe that had a membership of almost 30 girls, which I think we were organized for about 5 or 6 years with that amount of children in the organization, which was kind of phenomenal during that time period. My dad, I just recently found out several really interesting things about my dad, which I'd like to share with you, because you don't often hear a lot about him other than his some information on his architectural background. But my father worked on the design of 3 churches in Arlington, Callaway United Methodist Church being the last that he did in 1979, but he also worked in Warner Baptist, worked on the design for Warner Baptist Church in Bailey's Crossroads, and Mount Zion Baptist Church in South Arlington. My dad chaired the Neighborhood Conservation Committee, was the first chair for our neighborhood in that position. He was a board member for the Arlington Interchurch Committee on Housing for Low Income and Families. He was on the Arlington Council on Human Relations, the Northern Virginia Fair Housing Association, the Arlington Advisory Board on Health and Welfare, and both of my parents were members of the NAACP for over 50 years. My family, I'm so proud of my nieces and nephews and my great-nieces and great-nephew who unfortunately could not be here tonight, but my family comes from a long line of educators and entrepreneurs. We have a chemist, we have a dentist, we have an attorney in our family, amongst a lot of other things. And I just wanted to thank them for coming tonight and say to you, I'm so proud of you, and you are definitely carrying forward the legacy that came from our grandparents. My mother's great-grandfather was a Native American chieftain that owned enough land in Caroline County to buy the freedom of his loved one who was an African slave. That's the land that's still in our family. And this is, as my brother said, this is phenomenal that we're being honored today and that this school is going to be named after my mother. We're just so proud and so humble, and we thank you all very much.
Thank you so much. Appreciate you sharing your story. Appreciate that very much, and thank you to the Hamm family. I know you traveled far and wide to be here, and I know traffic in this area is not fun. So I appreciate that you did that, and we're really thrilled to be honoring you. All right, I'd like to move on to our keynote. So AHS would like to welcome author James McGrath Morris as our keynote speaker tonight. As we continue to commemorate the 60th anniversary of the desegregation of Arlington Public Schools, we have a deep appreciation for Mr. Morris. He wrote a landmark article entitled "A Chink in the Armor: The Black-Led Struggle for School Desegregation in Arlington, Virginia, and the End of Massive Resistance." Mr. Morris recounted as yet untold stories of what Arlington African-American community went through in desegregation. Arlington Public Schools, after the 1954 Supreme Court, mandated nationwide desegregation. Mr. Morris's detailed account of the effort to desegregate schools in Arlington has been widely cited as a seminal work. But more than earning academic acclaim, Mr. Morris has given long overdue credit to the women of Arlington who made the segregation possible. In truth, both African American and white women were on the front lines of the struggle. A lot of the accounts that we had prior to Mr. Morris's article were from white authorities, white journalists and white authorities. His article changed that as he reached out. I am going to stop there and have Mr. Morris come up because he has a story to tell, and we would like to hear from him this evening. Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to be back in Arlington, where we lived for a number of years. More than 2 decades ago, I had the honor of meeting Dorothy Hamm. On a certain day, a very nervous fellow that I was, I picked up the phone and called her. And her voice displayed a fair amount of skepticism. This white guy wanted to write about a history that had been suppressed, documents had not been shared, but she came to trust me. And one of the things it ended up doing is inspiring another book. I wrote a biography of Ethel Payne, who worked for the Chicago Defender at that time, and part of the reason that I gained the courage and inspiration to do it was because of your mother. But let me betray some enormous nervousness. When Ron Chernow goes out on the circuit to talk about George Washington, he does not expect to find his children in the audience. So bear with me as I tell the story in which you are all actors, and I hope I get it right. One thing I'm not going to do tonight is share with you, it's a caveat, this is a very complicated story. There's a lot more to it than I can tell this evening. It involves understanding history of segregation. It involves understanding jurisprudence, Plessy versus Ferguson, Brown v. Board. It involves understanding the Byrd political machine. It involves understanding massive resistance, all kinds of things. But that's not what I'm going to talk about tonight. The story I brought you tonight is about the women, the teenagers and the men who had the courage and temerity and the vision to bring down the ramparts of segregation here, and in the end, it's what they did that matters most. So on to the story. As it had been for countless other children in Arlington, the idle days of summer had come to the end for 11-year-old Edward Leslie Hamm, Jr. on the morning of September 5th, 1957. After donning a pair of clean khaki pants and a fresh-pressed short-sleeved white shirt, Hamm was heading back to the classroom along with 21,000 other Arlington students. That alone was enough to put a pit in any kid's stomach. I hated going back to school myself. But for Hamm, the day possessed an added dimension. Instead of riding a bus for 45 minutes to what folks then used to call the Negro School, 6 miles across the county, his parents were dispatching him along with 2 other black pupils to challenge the continued exclusion of blacks from the all-white Stratford Junior High School, later the one renamed H.B. Woodlawn, only a mile from their isolated, exclusively black neighborhood. Now, this is a full 3 years after Brown v. Board of Education, and not a single black student had yet attended a white public school in Virginia, the frontline state of resistance to school integration. The 3 children were nervous and took no comfort in thinking of themselves as a vanguard of the civil rights movement. I wasn't into an integration thing, remembered George Tyrone Nelson, who was 14 at the time and among the trio challenging the segregated schools that day. At 8:25 a.m., Edward, Joyce Marie Bailey, 13, and George Nelson appeared at Stratford Junior High School, accompanied by Geraldine Davis, one of several white women active in the Arlington branch of the NAACP. In comparison to the school that the 3 children had attended, Stratford was a splendid facility set on 9 acres of fields and woods. It looks still quite beautiful today. Although they lived within walking distance of this school, there was no question that the 3 young pupils were disturbing the pastoral calm of the setting by introducing the messy struggle of integration. Word of their impending arrival made its way through the school. Remember, this is 57. The events in Little Rock had dominated the news for several of the past days. By the time the group neared the front entrance, 300 of the more than 1,000 white students who attended Stratford had gathered. Unknown to most, plainclothes police officers were among the crowd of adults who came to witness the procession. The police had been alerted that black activists might use the opening day of school to draw attention to Arlington County's continued refusal to comply with the Supreme Court edict. The crowd, however, parted without incident. Geraldine Davis and the 3 students entered the school. They walked past a large black binder. They probably didn't know what was in it, but hanging by the door, this black binder contained all of the state's segregation rules if you needed to consult it. They were immediately escorted to principal's office, where Claude Richmond awaited them. I just told them their placement was not to be made in the school, he said. Therefore, they couldn't be admitted. So they all left. 2 of the students returned that day to Hoffman Boston School, the Negro Junior and High School where they'd been enrolled previously. Hamm, however, as we heard, returned home, unable to enter any county school. His parents, and you'll learn why, refused to sign this pupil placement form because they considered it part of the state's machinery to block desegregation. The free kids weren't alone that day confronting school authorities. Elsewhere in the county, 5 other students sought admission to the all-white school and 2 to the all-white junior high school and 1 elementary school. They were, of course, all refused. Now, meanwhile, nearby in Clarendon, which if you've ever walked through Clarendon, look carefully at the obelisk, black soldiers are listed from World War I, the dead black soldiers, separately from white soldiers. A guy named J. Lindsay Almond Jr., who was then the Virginia Attorney General, and he's the man who defended the state before the Supreme Court in Brown v. Board, meaning opposing integration. He was beginning his day of campaigning in Arlington. And reporters asked the candidate if he endorsed Harry F. Byrd's policy of massive resistance. This was the policy that was coming to be adopted in Virginia and other southern states to prevent blacks from entering any schools. Almond replied that he preferred a more flexible approach, quote, that evaluates each situation as arises. His definition of flexibility, as any of us could figure out, did not include permitting Arlington blacks into a white school. Now, the Hamm family lived in a smaller black community, which many of us know, in North Arlington, close to Lee Highway, known as Hall's Hill. The neighborhood traced its origins back to the end of the Civil War, when Captain Basil Hall sold building lots to emancipated slaves. A fascinating neighborhood, and I can't go into it tonight. But within the neighborhood, life for the Hamm children was much like that for any child in America: bicycle riding, basketball, hanging out. But beyond the enclave's confines, however, segregated Virginia was inescapable. The only playground open to black children had a few pieces of old play equipment and was too small even for a pickup game of basketball. And along Lee Highway was a field where children could ride ponies in a little ring. The Hamm boys frequently asked if they could go someday. Every time we went past it in a car, I would make some excuse, their father said. There wasn't a time, or there were too many people waiting, anything but the truth about what they couldn't do because of their color. It was making a liar out of me, and I knew that one day my sons would realize it. When it came to the schools, members of the Arlington NAACP branch were pinning their hopes on the possibility that there was a victory to come from the court system. And indeed it came. On May 17th, tomorrow, at 12:52 p.m., in a clear and unemotional tone, Chief Justice Earl Warren began reading the court's unanimous decision that Brown v. Board to a packed chamber in the Supreme Court 7 miles from Arlington. By the way, Ethel Payne was in the audience at the Supreme Court that moment. I love the connection between your mother's case and her being there. By 1:20 p.m., the nation's wire services were telegraphing the news that school children could no longer be segregated by race. Here in Arlington, the decision raised great hope among the activists. Official reaction, on the other hand, was muted. But within 3 weeks, white politicians from the south side of Virginia persuaded 61 county school boards to support segregated schools. On June 25th, Governor Thomas Stanley joined their ranks, declaring, "I shall use every legal means at my command to continue segregated schools in Virginia." I would add, he hadn't talked to Dorothy Hamm at that moment. One of those means was to appoint a 32-member all-white commission led by State Senator Garland Gray to quote-unquote study the problems raised by the court decision. And our friend Attorney General Almond added his opinion that the provisions of the Virginia Constitution and state laws provided for segregated schools was still in force no matter what the Supreme Court said. In Arlington, the school board's operating plan was also to study the situation. It appointed a committee to examine the problems involving integrating the school system. Ignored was, interestingly enough, the example of Arlington Catholic schools. Within months of the 1954 decision, they integrated their parochial schools in Arlington, no public outcry, no disorders, and no withdrawal of white students. The Gray Commission, whose hearings dominated the news, was, however, setting the agenda down in Richmond. Gray was a prominent member of the Byrd Organization, a leader in the 4th Congressional District in the heart of Southside, and a potential candidate for governor. The Gray Commission hearings became the forum on the issue. May 31 of 1955, the Supreme Court issued what everybody had been waiting for, which is the follow-up ruling explaining how Brown v. Board was supposed to take place. They said, in good faith, communities should proceed with the earliest practical date, but it was a very vague ruling, leaving folks in borderline states like this not knowing what to do. And the Gray Commission continued its work for an entire year. again, more delay. November 55, now we're a year and a half after Brown, submitted its report to the governor. It crafted a segregationist policy couched in language that avoided all kinds of defiant words. The commission proposed a series of measures that stressed local control of student placement, assuming that the boards would oppose any black students and black and whites intermixing in any way. If that plan failed, the commission proposed the state have the power to close any school that chose to integrate. The state would pay private school tuition for white families affected by school closings. The Gray Commission proposal to alter the state constitution required action by the General Assembly, but the debate immediately showed that there were only a few opponents to that, and they came from Northern Virginia. It was soon agreed to put a referendum up for the state voters, and the referendum battle was short. By a margin of 2-1, voters supported the Gray Commission. In Southside, the margin was 4-1. Here in Arlington, however, 10,000 folks voted against it. 8,000 voted for it. So this was one of the few communities to oppose this change. The Arlington School Board, a nervous group of people, began to take minuscule steps towards integrating the schools. But their issue was they wanted to make sure they were complying with the law of the land, Brown v. Board, because they had enormous bond issues going up to be approved and sold. And the bond salesman in New York said, you cannot be against the law of the land. So their minuscule steps towards integration had very little to do with your family or anyone else. They were worried about the bond issue being able to pass. That, however, the concern that the Arlington School Board was beginning to make plans for integration freaked out State Delegate Frank Monecure from nearby Stanford County. So he introduced legislation to strip Arlington of its elected board. 37 legislators signed onto the bill, and within a few weeks the election committee met to consider the proposal. 500 spectators came to the Virginia House of Chambers to testify. They had to move the hearing into the chambers itself. The mood was certainly not in favor of Arlington. Proponents of the legislation, mind you, wore Confederate lapel pins, and 7 of the 13 members holding the hearing had already proclaimed themselves in favor of the bill before a single witness testified. Arlington lost its elected board. Now we're up to the second anniversary of Brown v. Board. Spring of 1956, Arlington blacks were nowhere near gaining entrance to white schools, and not only had the county electorate lost direct control of the school board, but the state now was firmly in the hands of the segregationist forces. If I were struggling at that point, I would have given up. Your mother didn't. The Arlington struggle was no longer a local matter, if it had ever been. Any modicum of integration in Virginia had to be stopped. There is no middle ground, no compromise, said Bill Tuck, a congressman from the South Side. If you ever let them integrate anywhere in the whole state will be integrated in a short time. Defenders of state sovereignty and individual liberties, a racist organization formed by sheriffs, clerks, and legislators in the South Side in 1954, had quadrupled its number of chapters. It now had 12,000 members in 60 chapters, including one right here in Arlington. The NAACP was very clever. They selected 4 Virginia areas and tried to force the federal court to enact and push the observance of Brown v. Board. What they did is they went for areas in which blacks comprised a small minority, and which the Byrd machine was weak, and the public held ambiguous views about desegregation. So rather than go to a court case in the South Side, they chose places like Arlington. And the case was named Clarissa S. Thompson et al. Versus the County School Board of Arlington, because of the daughter of Ethel Thompson, who had been also an active NAACP member since 1947. You'll like this echo. When my mother asked me if I wanted to be in the desegregation case, I didn't really want to, recalled Clarissa several years later. I said, all right, I will, because I knew somebody had to do it. Somebody had to go up front. The Hamms were listed on the suit, as well as Edward Struthers, the newly elected president of Hoffman Boston High School, PTA, whose daughter Edna was in the 10th grade. Judge Bryan now is the key to all of this. He's a federal judge in Alexandria. And he seemed to be willing to follow the High Court's decision, but the Arlington Board was getting increasingly nervous. And of course, the segregationists in power in Richmond were watching every step of the cases up here in the northern part. July 31, 1956, after hearing oral arguments the day before, Bryan ordered that the schools be integrated, beginning with the elementary schools. He issued an injunction restraining the Arlington School District from refusing to admit a student on account of race or color if they were otherwise qualified for admittance. The Arlington branch of the NAACP finally felt jubilant. But a more careful examination of the ruling, as these things often the case, reveal a major flaw. The injunction had no teeth. It held that complaints alleging violation of the injunction would have to show that the students had exhausted all possible means to get in before they could come back to court. And it played right into the hand of the segregationists who that summer would come up with the pupil placement forms, and I think there's one in the case up front. And this took away from the school board the power to assign children to schools and instead placed it in the hands of state board members who, of course, were appointed by the governor, who, of course, did not want any African-American students to set foot in a school. It was devilishly clever ruse. Signed pupil placement forms had to be reviewed and processed and then sent back to the school board before the pupil could be enrolled. In other words, black student could be bureaucratically denied a place in school, but if they didn't pursue this avenue, Judge Bryant wouldn't be able to consider the complaint. Further, the act stipulated if there was any instance in integration of any school, whether the court ordered it or not, the state would cut off all funds to that school or district. So when Arlington schools opened in the fall of '56, if you're keeping track of the time, we're now 2 years and several months past Brown v. Board, black students were still no closer to getting into any white school in Arlington. "We were caught at a stoplight," said Dorothy Hamm. "We waited for this stoplight for a year and no decision had been made. Finally, a few students, some of whom were not plaintiffs in the suits, decided to ignore the light and apply for admission on their own. Thus brings us to that September morning of 1957. The 3 students, including you, sir, and others, staged their challenge as I described. Upon being refused, the NAACP immediately returned back to Bryan's court. The Attorney General Almond, now a candidate, as I said, for governor, rushed back to Alexandria because he wanted to fight against this case and perhaps persuade some more segregationists in the state that he was on their side. Hamm, Davis, and others participated in the event 6 days before, came face to face with Almond in the courtroom. Particularly galling to him were the actions of Geraldine Davis. On the witness stand, she's a white activist. On the witness stand, she tried to explain she felt this was an opportunity for whites like herself to show that they were Christians. Almond completely and every time tried to cut her off before she could complete a sentence. But she embellished each answer to his questions in a way to get her point across. She told the packed courtroom that she decided to accompany the children after reading about threats of bloodshed if they showed up at Stratford. "I thought," she said, "if there was any bloodshed, it should be white blood, and mine if necessary." As a reward, she got abusive phone calls at night to the point that Mrs. Davis took her phone and buried it in the hamper with a pillow on top, so she wouldn't hear it. Almond's efforts at restraining Davis or persuading the court ended up being of no avail to him. On September 14th, finally, Bryan handed down the strongest ruling to his date. He ordered that the following Monday, the Arlington School Board admit 7 of the 8 black students who were refused admittance on opening day, and among the children were Leslie Edward Hamm Jr. and George Nelson, who had tried to enter Stratford. Victory for the Arlington NAACP was approaching, but ever so slowly. It's hard to imagine anything more gradual than this. Sorry, I'm having a little problem here with my paper, said Hamm, than the rate of 7 Negro children to 21,000 whites. But even this small victory was again thwarted because the school and the school board and the state launched yet another series of appeals to postpone the day of reckoning. That fall, the Arlington families watched as the state elected their courtroom nemesis, J. Lindsay Almond, as governor of the state. So the man who most opposed what was going to happen here in Arlington was now in power in the state. When 1958 arrived, 4 years now, nowhere in Virginia was a black student attending a white public school, but the NAACP now finally got a sense that time was running out for the opponents. The time was approaching when the state would have to use its ultimate weapon, that of closing schools. This threat would turn out to be the undoing of massive resistance, because closing the schools in Southside where whites opposed blacks by a huge number didn't matter. But considering closing it here in Arlington, where Arlington people valued the schools as a valuable community asset, created a new set of problems for the segregationists in that it created opponents. They valued the schools more than worrying about whether their children were going to be sitting with a black pupil or not. That's very different than the South Side, of course. So as autumn approached, moderate Virginians found cause for fear that segregationist forces were gaining intellectual ammunition because this man, if you've not read him, it's really quite a treat. James J. Kilpatrick, I don't know if any of you remember him. He was the editor of the Richmond News Leader, and he began to crank out editorials to really stoke the fires of the segregationists. Well, in Arlington, an anti-integration organization called the 10th District Education Corporation distributed a Kilpatrick column in early summer. And in it, he said that the state should move promptly to close Fillmore Elementary School or any school in Arlington if a single Negro was admitted. So the line was really drawn at this point. The defenders, you remember them, they were headed by a white Arlington plumber named Jack Rathbone. He opened up the George Mason Grammar and Academy High School to accommodate white students should Arlington schools be closed. However, I don't think many parents took his efforts seriously, because outside of the building was a sign that spelled the word grammar, G-R-A-M-M-E-R. The clergy in Arlington also took action. 28 white pastors representing the Arlington Council of Churches wrote to Governor Almond to let him know that their churches could not be used as alternative schools should he close the schools. It was becoming apparent that massive resistance would reach its first real test when the final court orders were to be issued here in Arlington. The sentiment against Byrd, Almond, and massive resistance was growing here in Northern Virginia. Even the conservative chairman of the county board admitted publicly that his constituents preferred integration to closing schools. That summer, while the legal machinery continued to move at a snail's pace, 22 Arlington black students seeking transfers to white schools traversed a bizarre gauntlet, submitting themselves to the interviews by state and local officials. On August 18th, the State Placement Board set up shop in the Arlington Trust Company. Its members interviewed applicants. Before coming to the interview, the students met together in the Eldridge home, whose son had been ordered admitted to the 4th grade. At the Trust Building, the first parents who were interviewed immediately recorded the questions and supplied them to the parents waiting in the hall. In a sense, they aced the test. The following week, however, the State Board rejected every single application, including those made in Newport News. The Arlington Board also rejected the applications. The NAACP went back to Judge Bryan's courtroom. This time, they sought to include all 30 students in his 1957 desegregation order. Bryan, however, was on vacation in Europe and would not be able to take up the matter until September 2nd. But things began to seem like they were moving at last. And when he returned, Bryan gave his approval for opening up the Arlington schools on a segregated basis while he considered his new petition. So schools were going to be open. He listened as the school board told him that it examined all 30 Negro applications and found grounds other than race to reject them. On September 17th, Bryan issued his order. The pupil placement plan was not discriminatory, he said, in of itself. But 26 of the 30 students, including the 5 who were admitted in 1957, would not be allowed to be transferred to a white school. Instead, he found the plan unfairly denied the transfer of only 4 7th graders who lived in North Arlington and possessed test scores above the median in Stratford where they would be admitted. The criterion in the case of the 4 was solely that of something called adaptability. The 4 were Ronald Deskins, Michael Jones, Lance Newman, and Gloria Thompson, sister of Clarissa, whose name was on the original lawsuit. Edward, who 12 months earlier had courageously marched into Stratford, was not among them on that list. Bryan delayed the effective date of his order until January because the fall semester was already started. Officials in Arlington breathed a sigh of release. Remember, they were worried about their bond, they were worried about all these kinds of things going on, so another delay is not the end of the world for them. Governor Almond, meanwhile, had closed schools in Norfolk, Charlottesville, and Warren County after judges there had ordered black students admitted to those districts. In effect, the delay meant that Arlington would not have to begin desegregation and face school closing until after state and federal courts had an opportunity to rule on the constitutionality of the massive resistance methods they were doing. That fall, however, the Arlington NAACP branch prepared at long last for the implementation of Bryan's order. Victory must be coming, they felt, after these many years. Barbara Marks, a white activist who had seemingly boundless energy, came up with the idea of organizing workshops to prepare parents in support of white parents. They held secret social events so that the 4 black children could meet white Stratford students. A group of 90 black and white students were formed in a social group known as United Us that brought parents and children from North and South Arlington together in churches. On January 19th, 1959, 5 years after Brown v. Board, the state was celebrating the birthday of Robert E. Lee. Virginia's Supreme Court struck down the school closing law, the principal weapon of massive resistance, on the basis that it violated guarantees of public education contained in the state constitution. Later that day, that very same day, a free judge federal panel in Norfolk added its opinion. It declared that the all school closing statutes enacted in 56 and 58 were in violation of the 14th Amendment. Instead of giving up, however, our friend Governor Almond told the state in a radio and TV address the next night, "We have just begun to fight." In Arlington, where the first kids might enter, there was reason to be nervous. Judge Bryan was now in session almost every day, dealing with motion after motion after motion. At one moment, the Arlington School Board attorney asked the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals to stop Bryan from holding these hearings. The attorney said that love is an essential ingredient in school and that white teachers would be unable to love these colored children. The judges were not impressed. "It's clear that the transfers were denied on a basis of race," they replied. Bryan did order another delay, but this time only until February 2nd, 1959. On Sunday, January 25th, Almond called for a special assembly to meet in 3 days. With only 5 days left before the 4 black students were scheduled to enter the white Arlington school, legislators gathered with anticipation. Remember who these legislators are. Believing that Almond would provide them with a new plan of action. To their great shock and chagrin, Almond said, "The fight is over. That Virginia must abide by the land of the law." In the aftermath of his speech, only the most rabid segregationists did not understand at that point the fight was lost. In Arlington, the defenders gave Stratford students a letter as they left school on that Friday. "You, as a student at Stratford Junior High School, and your parents have been placed on a great battlefield, perhaps the greatest one our nation has ever faced," the letter read. It further urged the students to let you do your part to preserve your Constitution, your race, your white culture by taking your books home and continuing your studies there until the emergency has passed. At 8:30 a.m. on Monday, February 2nd, 1959, Marks arrived at the Hamm's house in Halls Hill. Excitedly, the fathers of the 4 chosen children burst into the Hamm's house a few minutes later after Marks arrived. They just dropped the kids off behind the school. Under the watch of half of the 170-man Arlington police force, the students had quickly walked down the sidewalk and into the school, where they were met again by Principal Richmond. He's the guy who turned them away several years before. At 8:45, when the school bells rang to announce the beginning of class, Stratford became the first school in Virginia to desegregate. 15 minutes later, Norfolk schools opened the doors of its white schools to black students. At the Hamm house, the group consumed bacon, eggs, hot rolls, and coffee as the phone rang nonstop. Marks, Hamm, the 3 fathers, Lily and Thompson, could no longer stand being absent from the school on that day, so they all piled into Marks's car. They approached Stratford. The police made them park several blocks away. When they walked up the street, reporters swarmed them. When they dodged into a friend's house via the back door, where they had more coffee and looked through the front window at the school and the police and reporters milling about. In the afternoon, Marks and Hamm managed to circle the school a few times by car. Hamm was sad because she'd not brought her camera to snap the shots of the police and their riot squad regalia. However, a public relations man from the New York office of NAACP in tow had a camera, and the pair went to Lance Newman's house, where the children were now eating potato chips and drinking sodas and recounting the day's events. An impromptu press conference with the children held on the porch of the house. And as the day came to a close, Marks took Hamm home, stopping at a drugstore to purchase the evening paper. The next day, 2,000 miles away, on a business trip in Caracas, Venezuela, one Arlingtonian woke to find a picture of Stratford on the front page of the newspaper. It was a day of excitement and happiness in Halls Hill, said Marks. There was a lot of laughter, chattering old and young. The introduction of these 4 students into one white school was certainly not an end of the struggle for black Arlingtonians. It was only one chapter in a long struggle that didn't really come to a legal end until 1971, when the school board adopted a court-approved, unitary, non-racial pupil placement system. The year after the forced black students were admitted into Stratford, the number of black students admitted to the white schools in Arlington grew to 42, including this time, young Hamm. Arlington was again ahead of the rest of the state by having the distinction of being the Virginia district with the most black students attending formerly white schools. Remember, that number is 42. Life for the students were not easy. Most missed their friends and confronted racist students, teachers, and administrators every day. Your mother shared with me, for instance, that one black student discovered a crudely made racist figurine in his desk on the first day of school. In June 1960, Barbara Harrelson and Hamm became about to become the first black students to graduate from Stratford, and now we know who was the first, thanks to Alphabet. Dorothy Hamm was called to the principal's office and asked that the 2 students not attend the prom because, quote, they would only be dancing with each other. Although it was hard for the first children, it was in the end the black parents who had risked the most and endured the greatest abuse. Our parents and the other adults who were involved at that time were pushing. These were really the people who were taking the chance, Ronald Deskin said, because they were the people who had the homes, they were the people who had the substantial investments they could lose, they were the people taking chances. We were just kids. The NAACP, following Brown, had recognized that Virginia would be the critical test to fight desegregation in schools in the South. And to beat massive resistance, the Virginia NAACP had come up with a strategy to fight where the bird machine was weak and the black population was smaller. And the plan worked. Arlington, Alexandria, Norfolk, and Charlottesville cracked the united front of resistance. When we started, Dorothy Hamm said, looking back years later on our struggle, our destination was just a few blocks. At the most, a few miles to the so-called white schools of Arlington. However, our trip covered hundreds of miles and took us almost 5 years to reach our first step. And the message I want to bring to you tonight is to understand what was so significant that occurred here in Arlington. The history of the struggle to integrate Arlington schools between 54 and 59 is one of the most critically important defeats in the Southern opposition to Brown v. Board. What the black freedom struggle accomplished here led directly to the end of the most visible state-sanctioned effort to oppose the Supreme Court edict. But this history also reveals something else. It reveals the central role played by blacks. While it's true there were white folks like Geraldine Davis and Barbara Marks who played important roles, it remains first and foremost a black-led movement. Portraying it anything else than a movement led by African Americans is to miss one of the central tenets of the story. Thus, in the end, Stratford, Hamm's neighborhood school that eventually became the first white public school in Virginia to admit black students, would become the breach in the ramparts of massive resistance upon which much of the Old South, from one end to the other, had pinned its hopes on. In 1996, there was a commemoration of the Stratford integration in '59 at the school. And sitting on the stage was your mother, Dorothy Hamm, along with 2 other students, Michael Jones and Ronald Deskins, Evelyn Syfax, who had been their teacher, Elizabeth Campbell, James Stockard, and O'Glenn Stahl, all famous Arlingtonians. For the first time in almost 40 years, said Dorothy Hamm, it's nice to be with panelists in a schoolroom instead of in a courtroom. And that's the story I bring to you tonight. Thank you.
Okay, the winner is 049091. Oh, woo! How about that? All right, good deal. Okay, see me as soon as this is over, and I'll give you your.
I would just like to say that I'm going to donate this to the Historical Society.
Oh, that's so nice. Thank you. Thank you very much. That was very gracious.